Welcome to the Grimfrost Podcast. Today's guest, Ben Raffield, Associate Professor at Uppsala University and expert on Viking Age warfare and slavery. So, Benjamin, welcome to the Grimfrost studio or longhouse.
Thank you. I really love it.
Yeah, great to have you here.
Thank
so,
you
how you doing, man?
I'm good, thank you. We're just at the beginning of the university year, so I still have a bit of energy.
All right. So it's a bit less towards the end, I guess. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So, had a great summer?
Yeah. Going and watching some great music.
All right, awesome.
Yeah.
And you're a regular at the Midgårdsblod Festival, I know, so.
I am. Well, yes, this was my third year, and it was great to see you guys play there. Yeah,
that's right. That was fun. So, let's just dive into it. You know, it's like we're actually here to talk about you and your work. So, first thing I want to know is like, how did you get into Vikings in the first place? I mean, you're obviously from Great Britain, like London, I guess, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. South of London.
So So why Vikings? Like, how did you get into it?
I wish I had some really inspirational story.
All right.
I as a kid, I knew I wanted to study the past.
Yeah.
But actually, as many, I guess, little boys are, I was interested in actually conflict and warfare. And actually going to university, I didn't think to actually pursue the study of the Viking Age at all. But what I was able to pursue was some courses in conflict archaeology, which was an emerging field within archaeology at that time. And in trying to think of a dissertation topic, this is that kind of consuming thing in the second and third years. I got to be honest. Actually, I was inspired by the music I listened to when I was an undergraduate. There was some pretty good albums dropping, and actually, listening to the lyrics and the themes, it made me think. I'm interested in conflict, and the people of the Viking Age, we have these ideas about this, stereotypical ideas of this being a time of violence, overseas raiding, whatnot. And I wanted to actually try and get into that. What was violence and conflict during the Viking Age? How did it impact people? How did it shape their lives, as conflict so often does today, right? And that was the kind of rabbit hole that I went down, and I've just never ever come up.
So I think I know the answer to this, but anyways, what music did you specifically listen to?
A lot of metal. And actually, say when I was an undergraduate, it was I discovered Tyr, the Ragnarok album. Ensiferum dropped a good album, and there was this Swedish band, something about Odin, 2006-ish.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. So then you wanted to pursue this. You started studying this, and like where did you study it? Like in Britain then? Or did you have to go abroad to study Viking Age, or?
No, not at all. In many ways, I was kind of self-taught. So I studied at the University of Birmingham, where we didn't have a strong medieval kind of component to our courses. But I studied. I was very lucky to have a supervisor who was very open and encouraged me to explore my interests. A gentleman named John Carman, who's a fantastic conflict archaeologist. That's what he deals with. So working within his remit, he was very happy for me to explore what I wanted to do. And that was, and so I owe a lot to that, actually. But yeah, it was kind of then just hitting the books and learning everything I could, which is, it's an ongoing process, right? So in that sense, it wasn't ever structured or anything like that. This wasn't planned.
It's just something that happened.
Yeah, and I feel very lucky for that to have happened. I almost fell into this. And like I say, that once you start reading, once you start getting into the subject matter, there's so little we know.
Yeah.
And that just kind of, I love that. Absolutely love that.
Yeah, but isn't that the case with almost all the best things in life? You kind of just fall into them and then just go with it.
Yeah, I think so.
That's great. Yeah. So you studied conflict archaeology. and you went into this, and then now you're at. How did the work at Uppsala University come about?
So you're getting the full life story now.
Oh yeah.
So I studied at Birmingham, undergraduate and master's degrees, and then for my PhD, I actually did want to, I really want to keep going with this. Obviously, being from the UK, what I wanted to do for my PhD was study how conflict shaped the landscape of 9th and 10th century England, and I wanted to work with the best in my field. And he'll be very embarrassed if he watches this and hears me say this, but I contacted Neil Price, who was then the professor at Aberdeen, and I said, I want to work with you on this, and I was lucky enough that he took me on. After my PhD, I actually ended up in all places in Vancouver, Canada, studying the Viking Age from an evolutionary perspective, using theory from evolutionary anthropology to try and understand Viking raiding. And it was there that I kind of got interested in, through study of conflict, the study of raiding, actually the subject of slavery.
Yeah.
And I was having a meeting with Neil, and I mentioned to him, I really want to actually try and get to grips with slavery as part of, not just part of conflict, but in relation to that, how this, again, what was the place of this practice within Scandinavian Viking Age society? And he said, well, I'm just happening to write a very large grant application for his project, which he got, the Viking Phenomenon, which was placed at Uppsala, and then that brought me there in 2017.
Oh, wow.
So again, it's one of these things where everything just sort of like aligned in a strange way.
It's great.
So yeah, it was from conflict archaeology to the study of conflict during the Viking Age to the study of slavery, and those are still the topics really that I work in from a broad perspective. So
we're going to touch on slavery a little bit later, I think, but I kind of want to get into another one of your specialities right now, anyways, which is Viking Age warriorhood, because you studied that as well. I mean, that's part of the conflict archaeology, I suppose. So now, how did the journey of a Viking Age warrior begin? Do we know that? Do you have an idea about that?
Well, this is kind of the one of the key questions that, for context, I was a part of a group of researchers. We were awarded a project grant, in 2023, to study the notion of a warriorhood in the Viking Age, and actually to kind of try and get underneath this stereotype again that we're still presented with today. And this is one of the key questions, actually, as part of this project that we want to address. And we're still working on that answer. But, I think from one perspective, this is something that you were probably born into. We have this ongoing question about who was a warrior during the Viking Age, what was a warrior. And for me, at least some of these, I would say maybe even the core group of the people that we would refer to as warriors, they're members of a certain social class, an elite social class, the kind of people who are able, in an age where you live off subsistence farming, to actually not have to do that and devote a proportion of your life to the study of martial, to martial activity.
Yeah.
So I think certainly it's something, this was a journey that began at birth. Many people who participated in warfare. But of course, the vast majority of the people who we call Vikings, the ones turning up in England and in France, they're likely also opportunists. They are, my hunch is, they're people who are mostly farmers. That's that's their lifestyle. But during the period, there was presumably, people weren't prohibited from carrying weapons. There is a material culture associated with violence that was open. You would see people carrying weapons. You would see armed groups moving around. You would attend events where these people were present. So there was a kind of more open culture of violence, and of course you can't escape that. And you must presume that most people would have maybe had some kind of perhaps not formal training, but they would have been aware of the need to be able to use weapons.
I mean, yeah, exactly. Because if you read the sagas, especially, you know that most people, even farmers, they would be able to fend for themselves with weaponry. But what characterized a warrior specifically, like a person of the warrior class specifically, what would you say would be like that separates them from like everyday people?
It's actually, I think, it's a process of self and collective identification. It is an identity. It's a persona. It's something that you model yourself on, and that is a lifestyle that is geared towards martial pursuits. And that may take many forms. It doesn't mean it's completely, it's all about kind of combat and raiding and battle. It's all of the other, the kind of the drama and the pomp surrounding kind of, the martial lifestyle. So it's, as I say, it really is a social persona that one embodies.
But would they have certain expectations, like a person for the warrior class? What expectations would be on them growing up?
No, it's a good question. I mean,
what do we know? I mean, most of the information, I guess, we have from the sagas, I would assume.
Yeah, but also I think from archaeology you can, and especially when it comes to what we would consider to be, for example, male burials, if we're going on the basis of material culture and ideas surrounding associations of certain types of material culture with certain people. But there is a sort of, kind of almost, not homogenous, but there is a broad kind of type of identity that one aspires to, and that's is surrounded by possession and use of weaponry. But I think, for members of this elite class, who might be the kind of the core warrior groups. I mean, I assume one would be would aspire to be competent,
yeah,
at least. And for example, it is quite likely that there was an element, say, a formal education in warfare, and how to lead, how to mobilize tactics and strategy. So there may well actually be a kind of a formal element of this that we can't see and we don't necessarily see. But again, I mean, when we look at kind of Viking activity in Europe, I mean, these are very, we characterize them, especially in the UK, they're the barbarians at the gates, right? But they're very competent in warfare. They're not just haphazardly turning up on the coast and getting lucky in raiding. I mean, there is I think you can clearly discern tactics and strategy. This is it's something that you plan for. It's something that you were good at planning for, and you were good at leading. I'm kind of going off the question here, but
no, but I like so the expectations were to train, to educate yourself as a warrior as well as possible, I guess.
Yeah.
So being born into this warrior class, that must mean that you start training at a very early age. So I know there are sources about this, but how common were like child soldiers?
We would of course call it's a modern term.
Yes.
To describe.
I mean, were you considered a child at the Viking Age if you were like 12 or 15?
Well, I think that's the key question.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at one of the famous, vaguely recent mass graves from England, Weymouth, a late 10th or early 11th century mass grave, dozens of guys with their heads cut off. You probably have read about it somewhere. But there are, there's people in there that in that grave that we would today describe as children. They're adolescents. It's possible at 12 or 13 you were considered a legitimate combatant.
Yeah, I mean, if your life expectancy is like 35, then you're middle age at that time. So
right. So one would presume that if you are participating in kind of overseas travel and warfare, I mean, that would start maybe at quite a young age. And we can, again, get kind of tentative insights into this from the archaeology. I mean, there's a small, because of the nature of preservation, there's a small corpus of kind of like wooden toy weapons from across the Viking world, which shows, like little kids are emulating their elders through play. Some of these actually, might also been suggested they might be training weapons as well. So maybe they're, at quite a young age, you would start being hit with a wooden bat, essentially, to learn combat. And maybe we could maybe talk about kind of, just to speculate, maybe even like 7, 8 years old, you would start kind of being aware of this. Because as you say, by 12 or 13 years, I mean, you could very easily find yourself on a ship, traveling somewhere with a group who, intending to engage in raiding.
Yeah, because we actually, before you came here, we had a little discussion about one of the characters from the Viking saga, which is Viking Åkesson, which, so he was 12 when he managed to join the Jomsvikings, even though their rule was no one under the age of 18. Yeah. And for us today, the age of 18 seems like, that kind of makes sense. I went to the military. I did my army service when I was 19. So that kind of makes sense. But like a 12 or 13-year-old, it's kind of weird for us. But do we know exactly like what the view were on children back then? I mean, obviously it's a completely different society.
Yeah, I mean, for us today, we define ourselves in a sense by biological age. When you're 18 in the UK, you can drink, you can drive a car, but not just in the past. I mean, in societies around the world today. I mean, you're kind of more considered. You enter into adulthood. Your entry into that is a longer, protracted process. It's going through maybe specific, for want of a better word, rites of passage, things you have to do that are socially expected of you, and fulfilling those kind of goals. It kind of marks transitional points, and so maybe the kind of the boundaries that we would today, very clear boundaries between legally childhood and adulthood. I mean, I think they were much more blurred, and much more extended over a much larger period of time.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well because, like today, like I just actually heard this the other day on the radio. They're talking about like maybe instead of dividing like kids hockey teams into age groups, into maturity groups. So even if you may be 7, you will play with 9 or 10-year-olds because you grow faster. Mm-hmm. So you're bigger than your other 7-year-olds. So that it would make more sense. And I guess that would be kind of the same thing. So like a 12-year-old who's matured early and is big and strong, he'll actually go to a raiding party to England and get beheaded at some point. Yeah.
Indeed. When you put it that way.
Yeah.
But not just that. I think also, displaying that they can, adhere to appropriate behaviors and they have certain basic skills and competencies, because that's something that would vary inevitably from person to person, how quickly, and again, it might come down to how much time you have during childhood to dedicate towards learning this stuff.
Yeah. Then again, like, what do we know about the roles that child soldiers, so to speak, would have? Like the very young, like if they went on a raiding party, do we know if they were actually partaking in combat, or were they just along to learn?
And this is to speculate, but which I have done, so I'm happy to keep doing it. But I wonder, for example, if you would presume, because we don't know, but one wouldn't be just thrown into combat.
Yeah.
You might accompany a group while they're traveling, but then you're kept back, as it were. Perhaps as you become more familiar with the rhythms of engaging in this kind of lifestyle, maybe you would be tasked with, managing elements of the camp, or not managing, but, cleaning things, maintaining weapons, making sure people have what they need, kind of like a later medieval squire.
Yeah.
And then, this is, again, this is speculation, but then perhaps that would, over time, you would be, more gradually exposed to actual combat itself. But of course, even that brought with it risks, right? I mean, if you're going to turn up in someone else's land with a group of, we're a raiding group, I mean, you chances are you wouldn't be spared, even if you're not directly participating.
Yeah. So another part of the warrior class that's been touched upon, especially in TV series like the Vikings, or even talking about like the warrior grave of Birka, is female warriors, because they are not uncommon in mythology. But what do we know about women warriors in these raiding parties? Like, were there? I mean, I assume, because most people I talk to, they say that there weren't like scores of women warriors, but they did exist. Do we know that for sure?
This is, of course, a bit of a controversial subject, and I don't think it necessarily needs to be. I mean, that's an important thing. My own view, again, is that based on a small number of written sources, we can, I think we can suppose that women did actively participate in conflict as people we call warriors.
Yeah.
But actually, I mean, and part of the thing that we want to again really address in this project that I'm working on is actually but there's more to it than that. There must be. And no, I personally, I think the certain representations of women warriors in the Viking Age in popular culture take it a little far. But I don't think that should detract from what I consider the likelihood that, of course, there would be women present within these contexts as active combatants. But with that, and again, I think it's important to take this debate and contextualize it with everything else we know. And that is, for example, during the 9th century, you had these very large Viking fleets sailing around Europe, going to England, France, Spain. And those were, these, but we're comfortable talking about these being thousands of people now, perhaps hundreds of ships, thousands.
Yeah, I think the Great Heathen Army is considered to be about 10,000 people.
Yeah, at the upper end of the estimates for sure. And of course, that's not just, in quotation marks, warriors. That is combatants and their families and artisans and merchants. So, of course, actually, again, we were talking about children just now, but of course, the entire spectrum of society, depending on the context, could find themselves within a conflict setting. And, of course, not everyone would have been intended to be an active participant in that. But, if you're, as we read in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in the 890s, with a large Viking army, elements of it go off raiding, and the women, as stay behind in the fortification, and it's attacked. We're going to just assume that people just sat down and let that happen? No, I doubt that.
Yeah.
But also with that, I mean, as I say, for me, what this notion of warriorhood, or the state of being a warrior is, it's embodying a social persona. And again, if we're to think that maybe I would say probably the core element of what we would call warrior society was an elite component of society, you can't exclude women from that. I mean, by virtue of social status, women would be deeply, involved in this aspect of society, and that's something we've given very little thought to as a whole. Because what are their roles within this? And I think that's something again that this debate over the famous woman warrior for Birka has kind of obscured a lot of that. It's obscured conversations that we should be having. And I think we'll understand that particular burial a lot better if we did have those conversations. And again, that's something we will in time try to get to.
Yeah. So going back to the raiding parties then, like how were they organized? Like even armies, how were they organized? Like how were they put together, basically? That's what I'm trying to get to.
You know, at the beginning where I said the kind of what I love about this period is we know so little. I want answers. Just kidding. But it's true. And again, these are kind of fundamental questions that I think with the kind of advances in our knowledge now, we know, for example, about the large raiding fleets in the 9th century, so on and so forth. Again, we need to return to these kind of questions. Of course, it depends on to start with, what it is you want to do. Are we talking about, a bit of short-term seasonal raiding, or are we planning on going off for
invading
time?
someone?
Yeah, exactly. But I think, I don't know. I'm speculating, but I think the smaller groups would presumably be organized at maybe a local level, within a collective of local communities. That's my guess. But for these larger fleets, of course, as we say, if we're talking about hundreds or thousands of people, these aren't a single group. They're multiple, likely autonomous groups that are coming together in ways that we don't fully understand because we can't get at those politics necessarily. But what they are is essentially coalitions of people, and of course, some of this can be organized, in a domestic, context, through perhaps the institution of the thing, the assembly. This is where people come together. They come to discuss things. Maybe this is where you come together and say, hey, we're going to go think about doing some raiding. Shall we get a group together and do this? So there is a framework there, I think, for this kind of, to have these necessary cooperative relationships. I think through the assembly, you do have that framework. But again, as we see in the historical record, once these fleets are out in the field, they're coming together, they're splitting apart. It's a very dynamic process. It's a constant, for want of a better word, evolution that these groups are going through. And again, like I said, we can't necessarily get at the politics of that, but we see, that from example, the historical record, that, the larger fleets might have 3 or 4 people who the chroniclers describe as kings. Obviously, that's their word,
And that always kind of fascinated me because, so you have 3 kings, and I think actually the Great Heathen Army is 3 kings. And actually, I think there's actually 5 commanders in total, I think, or something. It's what would the chain of command be? Who's the top honcho?
Right.
That's
a fascinating question. And one would, it depends on how you view this. I would presume there may be some kind of competition there. It's probably a volatile structure. Because, if nothing else, even if you can agree to share, strategic command, as it were, but who gets to negotiate? And because that must be a key thing. Who is the representative, the face of these forces? Or again, it's multiple people. But as we see again, actually, in relation to the Great Army, a couple of years before they're encamped at Repton, we actually read of that's in around 873. So maybe in around 871, 872, we read of a force commanded by a couple of jarls going out cross country to go and raid while the rest of the army is encamped, and they get absolutely obliterated. But we can see there that these groups, they're either, were they tasked with this, or are they actually using, they're saying, hey, we're going to go and do this, and we'll see you guys later. We can't know the degree of autonomy there. But I presume that this is actually, as I say, it's very dynamic, it's very fluid, potentially volatile. These people had to think on their feet, I think, to put put it simply.
Yeah. So, because you touched on this a little bit earlier, but like in this realm of this volatile kind of organization, like what tactics and strategies made them successful? Like, why were they so successful? Like, what were the traits that these kind of loosely put together groups? What made them such a magnificent force?
I think actually, I mean, partly it is that structure, especially when it comes to these larger fleets. I mean, my colleagues Neil Price and Chris Koymans have written on the concept of the hierarchy. It's a concept used to refer to kind of groups with kind of multiple autonomous components. If you lop off one head, there's still plenty of others.
It's like a hydra. Yeah.
But I think, this very structure in which they're operating. I mean, the rulers of Europe, Britain, and Ireland, they don't really quite know how to deal with this, because they're used to something more rigid form of warfare where you know who you're dealing with, and you can anticipate them. And I think at least initially these groups, they're so mobile, they're always on the move, and I think again that confounds their opponents, at least initially. It makes them very difficult to kind of pin down and actually use the structures, of your more organized kingdom, to bring that to bear on this force, because some of them are here, some of them are there. How do you try and contain that? And with that as well, I think, again, especially in England, these are the barbarians who came and they destroyed several kingdoms and paved the way for the rise of Wessex. Right? They are the barbarians. They're uncivilized savages. They come and they torch stuff and kill everyone. But actually, I mean, again, when you look at their movements, you look at how they're operating, incredible sophistication. I mean, they're just as sophisticated as anyone else in the art of warfare. I mean, they know, they to actually supply a fleet on the move is a huge logistical issue. So they have to, these whoever's in commanding these forces, they need to be comfortable with sourcing, the basic necessities, whether that's through raiding or diplomacy. When you pick to situate your camp for the winter, putting that near an institution where people are already gathering supplies for the winter, that's always a good one. So they're very aware of this. I think we can also talk about intelligence gathering as an aspect of conflict during the period. In my research on enslavement and captivity, when we read of these Viking forces turning up and taking captives and targeting high profile targets, specific individuals, they know where they are. They know when they're going to be there, and you got to learn that somehow, right? So again, I think there is an element of intelligence gathering. You can also learn this information from other captives, of course, if you take them during your activities. But I think having an information network would have been incredibly important. And again, it's something we don't really appreciate. So I think there's lots of things here, many, many factors coming together, which makes these groups so effective. Of course, what the rulers, their opponents are trying to do is, as I say, trying to contain them. And one of the fascinating things I see in England is that when the Great Army eventually agrees, or it takes Northumbria, it takes Mercia, East Anglia, and then it's Alfred of Wessex defeats them in battle, and they go and settle. Actually, that's the best thing that could happen, because it robs them of their mobility. And actually, when you see this, and then you see how history turns, I think that has a lot to do with it. By taking these mobile groups and now they're situated in one place, a lot of that threat goes away. So it's it's many factors.
Yeah. So, but how would you say that the tactics and strategies of the Vikings developed over time? Were they this skilled at the beginning of the Viking Age, or did they learn and adapt?
I can't believe they didn't learn and adapt. They're very versatile. We see this.
Yeah.
They know how to, for example, manage diplomacy and who to promise what and when. I mean, again, they're very savvy, right? I mean, just as you would expect them to be. But I think a lot of our knowledge here is obscured by the historical record, or the kind of the lack of detail in the historical record. There's been some really interesting research, for example, some years ago now. I was going to say recent, but it was actually 2016, 2017. My colleague Claire Downham in Liverpool wrote a fantastic article about the earliest Viking raids in England. And of course, we have Lindisfarne, right, the famous one. But actually, it's not until, the 9th century, the 2-3 decades into the 9th century, that you actually start to, again, see a kind of real uptick in raiding, which has always been, we've just assumed there's not so much going on. But actually what Claire has shown through the study of English charters is that there seems to have been a much more intensive Viking presence in England, at least areas of England, than we believed. And even at a very early stage, they might have been coming and establishing encampments, at least seasonally, maybe not, who knows, not staying over the winter. But it implies a much more intensive presence from the outset. And if that's correct, and I don't see why it shouldn't be, then actually, our kind of whole view of this, as you say, kind of how did tactics and strategy change, may actually in a way be a product of the historical sources, that we see these supposed hit and run raids where they come and they go. And it's only in the middle of the 9th century that they start staying for longer periods of time, and the fleets are suddenly bigger. Maybe that's not the case at all. So it's very hard to talk in that sense about the adaptation there. Who knows? We might keep digging into these sources. We might get more of an idea. I like to think that there's more to learn.
Always, isn't it? So, yeah. Anyways, we touched upon this as well earlier. The warrior class is just one of the classes. But what did the social hierarchy of the Viking Age look like? Like, what were the classes?
Oh, that's a very good question.
How would we define the classes today? Like a warrior class, farmers, I think we have a tendency to kind of present the society of the Viking Age as we see kind of modern society, like the kind of idea of a social pyramid, with powerful rulers to this kind of aristocratic, perhaps warrior class, and then the less high status farmers, and then of course all the lower class people who no one really cares about, the tenant farmers, the enslaved, whatever. And I think actually it's much more complex than that. I think it's again quite like the organization of these fleets. This is a social structure that is more fluid. Yeah. So of course you do have families, kinship groups with their networks who they are, they're situated in a better place, politically, socially, economically. But I think I speculate, I guess, that actually, mobility within those groups and mobility into and also out of them was probably a lot more fluid than we would think. I guess if you're a participant in an average farmer who goes off and participates in a raid and you do very well, actually maybe you just kind of that's a great boost for your social status and your social position. So yeah, maybe these classes were much more blurred. Maybe we can talk about different spectra of social status and distinction. But with that, of course, I think it's not just important to focus on those kind of the
the elite class, but also that means that this kind of situation was applicable all the way down, as it were, if we're going to talk about a social hierarchy or a social ladder. And I think that would be this kind of situation was also applicable to many of the lower status. We call them lower status. I hate using that term, but
yeah.
But what else does one use? Subjugated peoples, perhaps. So I kind of, rather than a pyramid, I see a kind of just a mass of different groups, competing and cooperating to raise their status at the expense of others. Also, of course, losing status. I mean, something, again, I think about when I lie awake at night. What happened if you send your local, a group of your local community off on a raid and none of them come back?
Yeah.
Which must have happened fairly regularly,
Probably.
Right?
Viking ships were great, but maybe not the most seaworthy ships in the world, I guess.
Yeah, and of course, they got to go and meet some really angry people at the other end. What would that do to a community? Yeah. What are your prospects like in a kind of a worst case scenario like that? And so again, I think that's in a way because again, that would have a huge impact, I assume, on say social status and mobility and even the ability of certain groups to survive. So yeah, it's complicated. Yeah. It's basically the answer.
So, but so the take is that the social classes, the lines were kind of blurred, and you moved in and out of them depending on your situation. Like I would assume, or your ability to maybe, as a farmer, take your axe and join a raid or whatever. But obviously, there's one class, or if we even should call them a class in that sense, that couldn't do that. So, talking about slaves, and you mentioned it before. So, what do we know about Viking Age slavery? Like, what did the life of a slave look like?
There's been this was a quite a big topic of study a few decades ago, and actually in the last 10 years, it's really exploded again as a topic of interest in a really good way. We're starting to kind of, I think, really try to understand these very basic questions, because again, these are people who are, and we're talking about in Scandinavia a prehistoric period anyway, right? It's the late Iron Age. But even in historic settings, these are people who are written out of history. They're always in the background, but no one really talks about them. So this is, I think, where we really are starting to learn things, or at least make really nice informed guesses. And I think that life, I don't think we can talk about the life of an enslaved person. I think there was many variable lives that one could have. Ranging from doing back-breaking labor in the fields to serving in a domestic setting, to also being a full member of the household. Captives taken as marriage partners, for example. What that means in terms of your social status, we don't know. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that even within this kind of homogenous group of people that we would call enslaved, there is a huge range potentially of different roles and life ways that they would lead.
So, like, does that mean that like all slaves were kind of a possession that you could do whatever you want? Could you as a like rape a slave, kill a slave, without like any kind of consequence?
Yeah. So our sources for this, they're later medieval law codes, which and they're the earliest surviving Scandinavian law codes in textual form. And it has been suggested that these do preserve elements of earlier Viking Age oral legislation. And one of the interesting things about these codes is that they are very, they have a great concern in defining the lives of these people that we call thralls.
Yeah,
which we to us, this is someone who we would describe as being enslaved. I think it's important to actually make that distinction there, rather than just these are thralls. And in some of these law codes, it's very clearly stated that they are chattel. They are seen as property in a legal sense. So, of course, the slaveholder does have certain rights over those individuals' bodies. So to kill, to harm, to commit rape, those things, I think, at least in some, they, to some extent, they were socially acceptable. And enforcing this point, if you damage someone else's property, this human being, you would pay a fine, of course, to the slaveholder, not to the enslaved person. And that really does reinforce this. I mean, they're legal. They can be a legal possession. They're also an economic force, right? And I think that says a lot about the place of these people in society if they're legislating for them economically. So you injure someone else's thrall, in quotation marks. You pay the slaveholder because it's not only an insult to them, but they're going to lose out economically on the labor. So, yeah, there's certainly, I think, a sense that these individuals were property. But again, there's lots of grades of distinction in this. We talk about thralls quite commonly, but there's many words used to describe people who seem to be in these in these kind of situations of being enslaved or of subjugated status. And some of these individuals appear to be, and actually the meaning of these terms changes over time, which is important as well. In later periods, they may not necessarily mean someone who's enslaved, but just someone of lower status. But at the same time, we see, for example, that they could run estates. There's the famous runestone from Hovgården near to Birka, where you have a runestone raised by a man named Tolir, and he's a briti, or an unfree steward, let's say, of the royal estate. And this guy's raised a runestone to himself. What does that mean?
Yeah. There's also a runestone actually south of Stockholm, close to where I grew up, which is also, I forget the inscription exactly now, but it's someone rose it for, I forget the name, but someone who was a slave. Yeah. That used to be a slave. So speaking of that, and getting back to a little bit what you talked about earlier, like, could a slave become free? Like, how? Because also in mythology, or at least in the sagas, there are not uncommonly so that slaves are freed. Mm. But what did that mean? Did they become full members of society, or
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think it's a short answer. Manumission was a thing, and probably quite regular, I would hazard to guess. And of course, how that process took place varied regionally. And we also, when we talk about the law codes, I mean, this is just the way things should be done, rather than the way necessary things were done. But for example, you might, to free an enslaved person, they might have to make a payment. Which is interesting because it implies they can acquire property of their own. But also certain ceremonies one would have to go through. There's forget which law code, they mention like a freedom ale that they need to brew and pay for being brewed, so they can do have a skull, But after that, and it's important to, I think you asked about social structure. I think one of the most important things about the social structure of the Viking Age is that everyone is obligated to someone else. It doesn't matter what we would call free you are. We place so much weight on individual freedom in this day and age, autonomy of the individual. But actually, that's not a good thing during the Viking Age, right? You're part of a collective, and if you're not part of that collective, you're in trouble.
Yeah, that's actually one of the worst punishments you can get is to get thrown out of that collective, because
Exactly.
you're left to fend for yourself.
Absolutely.
And anybody who you meet can kill you without consequence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So with that, everyone owed obligation. No, those obligations extended from an enslaved person to a slaveholder. These people are actually mutually dependent on each other. One for subsistence. Well, actually, in a way, both for subsistence. The enslaved depend on slaveholders to feed them, shelter them, clothe them. The slaveholder depends on their labor. And actually, post manumission, those ties would presumably remain. So you would remain. And we see this, for example, in ancient Rome as well, right? Freedmen retained very close personal links to the former slaveholder, and they would still owe, various obligations to them. And then I think that's probably the same kind of relationship we're looking at here. In some saga narratives, you also see people being freed to then be, to run estates for their former the slaveholder. So in a way, it's a way of kind of, freeing yourself of the obligation of having to maintain this person, and you still get them to work for you, right?
It's a win-win.
Indeed.
Oh, yeah. So slaves were obviously like an important part of Viking society in general, but did slaves also partake in raids and warfare, would you say?
I think there is a kind of an indication that could be the case, that you might send someone in your stead if you couldn't participate, if it was required. I mean, this might be something we see later in the kind of legislation relating to the medieval levy. And there is this kind of, this question is always, did they take slaves and make them row or whatever? But there is some interesting, very tentative, interesting evidence regarding that. I believe one of the Frisian law codes, and I'd have to check with my colleagues which one, but it actually describes that, if you've been taken captive during a Viking raid and then forced to raid your own homeland, that actually you couldn't be prosecuted for it if you managed to get home. So actually, the idea of kind of, forced to military labor in that sense, may be true. Of course, also, if you were an opportunist who just thought you could make a quick buck, you could always say you were taken captive and made to raid, your neighbors down the coast.
Yeah.
So I think there could be contexts within which this did happen. Yeah. I couldn't say how regular or common this was.
Yeah. So the slave, you already mentioned the economic factor, that they were an economic force, actually. So how were slaves taken, like transported? I mean, obviously that's a big deal, but also sold, because, I mean, it's actually fascinating to imagine that you're taking a bunch of slaves from, let's say, Ireland, and then you're going to transport them in an open ship with limited resources and make these slaves survive all the way to Denmark or Norway, which is, I guess, normally where you would go. Like, that's where people who raided the British Isles and Ireland normally came from. Like, that's a kind of perilous journey, actually. And like, yeah. So how did they do this? Like, it's like,
right?
Yeah.
I'm going to sound really pedantic here.
Yeah.
When I write about this, I often talk about captives and enslaved people.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because, and I see a
big difference. Yeah, of course.
I think there is a difference.
Yeah.
I mean, say in certain areas, and in Ireland in particular, at least according to the sources, the Viking groups that are taking captives there, they're often recorded as ransoming, at least the high-profile ones, the ones they know they can get something for. So actually, I mean, they, in some or many cases, there may not have been an intention to ever keep these people. We'd see it not only in Ireland, but also in the attack on Seville in the mid-9th century. They take captives from the city back to their camp, and then they actually ransom them. back to their community. So that's a good way to make all the riches you want, right? Without yes, and you don't have to keep anyone alive.
Yeah,
because that takes that and especially as you say, if you're operating, if you're a shipborne force, you have a limited capacity to even feed yourself. So to take extra bodies and keep those alive, that's not easy. That's a logistical challenge. So selling these people back to their communities is always a good one. Plus, it means you can come and do it again. You're not wiping these communities out. But I do believe that we probably, in cases, did have people being transported to marketplaces and being sold. There's a really interesting Irish source, the life of Findan, became Saint Findan, and this poor guy was taken captive twice by Viking raiders, and the second time, it actually says that the group that took him sold him on to someone else, and then sold him on to someone else, and they may have even sold him on to someone else, but it was three exchanges, I think, and they decided to go home and take him with them. So,
wait, was he the guy who told the Vikings they were ransoming some captives, and when they came to pay the ransom, they took those people captives and asked for ransom for them?
They pulled a fast one, yeah.
And they said, well, you can't keep doing this because...
it's not on.
Yeah. It's like, oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah. So, yeah, sorry. It was just, okay. It was just...
No, but I mean, actually, you raise a really good point. I mean, they're the rules to this game.
Yeah.
And if you break those rules, you can't just go around taking the people who come to pay the ransom, because no one's going to come and pay the ransom.
No. Anyways, so he eventually, he became a captain. He came to Scandinavia. Yeah.
Well, he never got there because he escaped. So that's a kind of seems to be an informal exchanges between groups. So you might not take them to your captors to a market. You might offload them, pay off a debt, curry some favor with the right person, have a gift, a body I don't have to maintain anymore. But presumably, and I do think there were certain marketplaces where were kind of hubs for the trafficking of people. Dublin in Ireland is often hypothesized to be one. And presumably the major, what we might call, emergent, urban or proto-urban settlements in Scandinavia, Birka, Hedeby, would presumably be the places where it's happened also. But of course, as you point out, I mean, it's a major logistical challenge to get people to a viable marketplace. So one actually might presume that those numbers aren't very high. That doesn't make it any less important, but again, we can only speculate as to how many people were transported and sold in this way. But we do have a small, very small corpus of what look to be shackles from some of these sites, which I believe do suggest that people were being taken and sold alongside all kinds of other goods as well. This is something we also need to remember about. We're going to call it slave trading. I mean, these captives are just one resource that you would have transported alongside others. There's plenty of things you're trading, and actually to invest entirely in captives would be not be a great idea, apart from the difficulty of maintaining people, keeping them alive. I mean, what if they get sick? Take out your whole cargo, right? But then this does raise questions concerning, what we have perceived to be actually a very large slave trade in the Viking world. And actually, no, there was a large slave trade in the Viking world. We're talking about specifically the Scandinavians, trading in captives and trafficking captives. But it's impossible to say what I think it's impossible to say what the size of this was in terms of X number of people per year. I mean, there have been calculations done on the basis of dirham fines, these silver coins from the Middle East, which have been argued to, talking about thousands of people being taken and sold each year, which might not be as high as some people would think. But again, you also got to consider that if any slave trading is taking place, as well as, captures being just one resource, one form of cargo has been transported, they're not just paying for them in silver. They're getting lots of things for them. So in that sense, the scale may be underestimated if we're going to go on the basis of silver and try and equate how many dirhams to buy a person.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult estimate.
Yeah. So how common was slavery or slave trading in Europe as a whole during that period of time?
I would venture to say that almost every society exploited enslaved people. The big concern in Christian Europe was the selling of people to pagans, because then you you lose their souls, right? But there is evidence for continental slave trading, and of course, there is warfare. There is captives being taken as part of warfare. Both combatants and members of local communities, and so I think every society in a way was exploiting these people or profiting from the taking and transport and sale of them. Yes, but again, it's hard to quantify that in many ways. And there've been a lot of debates about the landscape of slavery in Europe and Britain and Scandinavia, but again, this this debate has gone through a process of evolution over many decades, and something that everyone very keen to say is we're not talking about massive, large scale economic slavery that we used to imagine in the Roman Empire, which is being questioned as well in its own way. But certainly, we see in the records there were people being exploited on large farms and estates.
But if you're a person being exploited, did that necessarily mean you were a slave or a thrall, or were you just someone who were, well, for a lack of a better word, employed for a very lousy salary? Or because you already mentioned that there are sources of people who essentially are slaves or thralls, but they still can have property, they can have farmland, yeah.
This is actually one where I would pass you off to one of my colleagues who knows about continental Europe, and
yeah.
I'm not going to.
No, I'm back in Scandinavia now.
Okay. I think again, we've been talking about this these spectra of society, and again, I think the lines of what we might call being enslaved and not might have been very blurred and quite close to each other in some cases. This idea of tenant farmers, people living on land and working it, they don't own it, they owe obligations to whoever does own it. Sorry. This is it's certainly an asymmetrical relationship, we might say, very clearly. But those people still, and again, this is where the influence of the later law codes, I think we do have to acknowledge that, but there does sound to, it's a question of rights. What rights does one have? And while even the enslaved or the people who are described as thralls have, they are acknowledged under the law, and they have in some cases, very small rights under the law. They don't have the abilities necessary to make determining decisions about their lives. And I think that's what it comes down to. Of course, there's various relationships of subjugation and oppression, but I think there is always going to be some kind of line as to what extent you have the right to make decisions. But of course, the reality of that might be very different.
Yeah.
As it is today. We have people living in conditions today of slavery, and then again, those conditions vary in many ways.
Yeah. So, how important was slavery in Scandinavia as a whole? How important was it, and what would the society have looked like without it? Would the Scandinavians or the Vikings have been as big a force?
So that's one of those kind of. It's a really great question. Very difficult to answer. I think that the fact that we do see, however we interpret the later law codes, the fact that there is legislation for this group, governing their lives, you don't create this for nothing. So to me, that indicates that this is a sizable and important group within society. At least, the exploitation of them is important. So I think we can say that. There's been a lot of debates about the kind of, the exactly how many enslaved people were there in terms of, percentage of the population. And I'm not going to go into those. We have some very high estimates, 25% down to 5%, 2%, 3%. And there's merits for all of these kind of arguments. But I think we can focus on these certain things. One, they are legislated for. Two, it doesn't necessarily matter whether they're, in economic terms, a large force. If you have, 10 enslaved people working on your farm or 2, what these individuals do is they allow you to create surplus to have extra, whether you're going to exchange that or actually is it just extra resources to live off. Or more perhaps importantly, the prestige of being freed from that work yourself. So, to own people and use them in this way, I mean, even if it's not a massive economic force, the fact that you can do it and also have the means to sustain them in the first place. But if you're freed from your daily grind, that's a huge thing in itself. So I think that kind of brings together these, you do have kind of arguments about, were they a labor force or kind of like a fancy bit of furniture that you had hanging around your house? I think actually those arguments kind of meet each other in the middle in a way. So I would say, they're certainly an important group, and for many reasons, again. And actually the way, as I said, these people's lifeways, they must have varied greatly.
Yeah.
So I think that, again, that goes with that. Their place and status and identity and roles in society would have varied greatly, perhaps even among local communities.
Yeah, because I think what I'm getting at a little bit is that, Scandinavia back in the Viking Age weren't like a massively populated area. So if you take the people of Scandinavia and you put together an army of 10,000 to sail to England to conquer, who's going to be at home taking care of stuff?
This is it. Yeah. I think these are questions we, again, need to think about more.
Yeah.
For sure. Also something I've thought about a lot, but never quite really managed to even get my head around is, the kind of how, if you're constructing a fleet with the intention to go off and engage in raiding, whether you're intended to come back or not. It's such a huge investment of labor resources. How do you get to that point in the first place?
Yeah, just to sail alone takes years to make.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Right. And again, there's something I think we're very much in the process of still figuring out. Because, in terms of logistics, these cooperative relationships I was talking about earlier, how did you manage those? Who decided who to undertake these ventures? Who was able to coordinate those resources? One would presume that would need a large labor force. But then, was this because now these communities are able to make use of large-scale enforced or enslaved labor? Or are we just assuming that because the task seems so great that we actually can't necessarily compute it yet?
Yeah, it's sort of the building of the pyramids.
Right, yeah.
Everybody imagines it's built by slaves, but it turns out it's actually built by paid labor. So it's kind of interesting. Well, I wanted to go back now, kind of leave the slaves alone, let them rest for a while, and talk a little bit about warriors. But I want to go into more like like a personal, like a detailed kind of individual level. So we talked about warriors, armies, and like on a grander scale, but is it possible to describe the mindset of like the individual Viking warrior? I mean, like obviously not every one of them, but like on an average way.
Mindset is one of the most difficult things to get at when you're studying the past, especially a prehistoric period.
But with the stuff that you know, what would be your like thoughts on it? Like, I mean, I'm not asking you as like this is the way it was, like just imagining.
No, sure. I mean, the reason I'm saying this is because actually, again, this is something that must have varied so much, from on an individual basis. But again, I think what we can say at least is that to be involved in this kind of activity for some people, whether it's a certain, what we might call a social class within society or a subgroup of people, this was something that was perhaps socially expected. So it was something you were meant to do. It's part of proving your competency in appropriate behaviors, right? So it's not necessarily something, it's an aspiration, but one that's socially expected of you. For others, it might have been a way, people, so because not everyone does it, people want to improve their social position, improve their family's position within the social hierarchy, as it were. Again, there might be a drive to do this, and that might be your kind of your main motor.
Yeah,
right.
So how big a role did loyalties and kinship like play in a raiding group, or like for a like Viking warrior?
That's an interesting question, and it's something I think we can actually get at. There's certain runestones, for example, actually explicitly describe people in the same family serving in the same retinue, or traveling abroad and engaging in raiding. Of course, in the last 10 years, we've been able to examine the finds from Salma, those two very early burials from Estonia.
That was like a bunch of family members, right?
Yeah, the genetics suggests that several brothers, and possibly an uncle.
Exactly,
all together in this mass grave. And it's funny because I think there is at least, I think that there must be a kinship basis for this kind of activity, but I think it's Egil's saga. They actually describe Egil and one of his friends is outfitting a fleet for raiding, and he takes with him members of his household and some local farmers' sons. And I think actually maybe with Salma, that's, maybe this is the kind of thing we're seeing. It's a small group of related people and perhaps a wider political network.
Yeah, and also, speaking of Icelandic saga, in the Njal's sons all go out on raiding, all of them, and Njal, like in a famous like part of the story, he dreams like who's going to make it back home, like how many of them is going to make it back home. It's.
And again, right, I mean, that's you might think like, wow, everyone's going, what happens in the worst case scenario, but again, to be left behind, maybe that's not something one would aspire to.
No,
it's a social expectation here. But if you're able to draw on as well, if you are a member of more powerful families, to be able to draw on your political alliances, these people who owe you something, and to bring together a group like that, even maybe from a relatively local area, that becomes possible.
So is that one of the reasons why kinship in these types of excursions or like expeditions were that very important?
I think so. But and the problem is there's several hundred years between them. But I find it very interesting that you have, again, this later Viking Age grave from England, the one in Weymouth. And the analysis of that group suggests, or last time I checked anyway, suggests a much wider geographical set of origins for those individuals. So perhaps, we're going from Salma, mid-8th century, to Weymouth around the turn of the 11th century. You talked earlier about, kind of the how things developed over time. Do we actually, as part of, the historical chronology of the Viking Age, do we actually see a move from more local groups, these fleets turning into something bigger? Well,
an
interesting question.
Yeah, I guess you can imagine that that if you're going to put together a raiding group, you want the best people you can get. And it doesn't necessarily have to be your brother or your uncle. It can be your cousin or that guy in that village, like across the pond that you met twice. So yeah, I assume that people would realize that it might be better to put the best people together for such an excursion.
Well, there is that as well, but one might actually, you might presume that then this was something that people wanted to do. The benefits if you survive are obviously quite great. So actually, I think it was Charlotte who had on here a couple of weeks ago. We in a conversation, posited, would you maybe actually have to pay to be on one of these things? So maybe it's not necessarily about being the best. Maybe maybe you really, this was something, and we see this again in kind of I think in relation to the so-called Ingvar stones, relating to this 11th century raid. There's people coming together to join this fleet from across a huge area. It's the entire Mälaren district and beyond. So, and again, this is the late Viking Age, but I think word gets out about these things. You asked earlier about how one would, how does a force like this come together? It's got to be, to an extent, it is through these networks. People hear about something. Hey, this guy Ingvar down in the southern shore of the lake is putting together a raid. I'm gonna go.
I want a piece of that.
Exactly. Because again, if you survive and you come back, that could be quite transformative for you, right?
Of course, yeah. So, but right, say you do head out on something like this. You hear about Ingvar's raids and you want a piece of that and you want to get out there and do this, and you go out and you stay out for years and you fight battles and your friends die and maybe you get injured or whatever. Would you return a normal man or the same person you were? Obviously not the same person, but like would there be like what we I guess today would call like post-traumatic stress disorders, or like would there be any kind of damages, like mental damages from these things, you think? Or like how were people wired back then?
There's actually been some debates on this. Me personally, having been lucky enough to never be involved in conflict, I can only imagine that this does change how it does shape your way you act, your beliefs, your way of looking at the world. But at the same time, there are arguments that actually there's these conditions that we might refer to as post-traumatic stress didn't really exist until actually the advent of gunpowder and firearms and especially artillery.
Shell shock.
Indeed, yes. Yeah. Where you can be obliterated from something miles away and you can't do anything about it. In the past, you faced your enemy, you were face to face with them, you could see them. But I can't imagine this wouldn't impact you in some way. And actually, I think something we would be interesting to explore is whether, again, delving into the literary sources that we have, how, because I haven't actually looked yet. This is something I would love to do. Did you have to accommodate people coming back from warfare in some way? Was there certain, we might call them rituals that they had to engage in on the return from warfare? How did you integrate them back into society? I think that's a really important thing to consider. And again,
like when I go away touring for a month, it takes me at least a week to get back into my normal rut when I'm back home, like my normal routines. Imagine being away for fighting battles for 5 years as a farmer, and then coming back and, all right, I got to go out and plow the field now. It's got to be like a complete different way of living.
And again, if this is if you have individuals from the same local community, they're coming back without their friends, without their family members. There's a void there.
Yeah.
Again, I can't imagine that didn't have an effect. What that effect was, I'd be really interested to explore that.
I would imagine it would affect the people at home as well. Like, you don't hear from someone for like 2 years maybe, and they never come home. You don't know where they are.
When do you presume they're dead?
Yeah.
Right? But it's and you do. I think when you read some of the runic inscriptions, of course they're mostly later, like the 11th century or whatnot. But you do kind of get this kind of feeling, when they talk about, their son is lying in Circland, he's still there, he's never coming back. And at the same time, you have this contrast where these people are celebrated for what they're doing as well, that they died properly, doing the proper thing.
Yeah. So that brings me to another thought that we were talking about earlier. So do you think that the Vikings were more ferocious on the battlefield due to their religious beliefs?
I think religious beliefs.
I mean,
I was going to say, actually, I mean, this is I think based on we see in the world in recent years, absolutely.
I mean,
religion can play a huge part.
But I mean, the Vikings were fatalists, so supposedly they would embrace death in battle because that would mean, well, first of all, they thought their life was like the lifespan was predetermined. Mm-hmm. Their thread was spun. But also death in battle meant coming to Valhalla, free mead, women, and fighting all day, and feasting all night, basically. So you would imagine that, like, do you think this was something that was very, like, extensively rooted in the mentality of the warrior class, or?
One could say yes from the evidence we have, from the written sources, and of course, if people genuinely believe this, then that's got to be a huge, not just a kind of not necessarily motivation, but a comfort, right? If you don't come back, you die horribly in the mud somewhere. But I think as well, if and again we go off the.
Then again, you die from a splinter from the shields.
Oh, indeed.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, again, if we go off the small, the written corpus, which is very small and presents only a fragment of what we can presume people thought and the way they saw the world. But then, as you say, there's kind of this fatalism. If your life is already, your thread has already been woven, and actually just striding to meet that head on, that's admirable.
Yeah.
Rather than cowering from it or trying to avoid it, no, you just walking straight towards it. And again, I think that's kind of, it is the attitude we see in some of these commemorative memorials. It's, these people died doing what they this was an honorable and proper death, as opposed to someone, dying of, even worse than the splinter from the shield, but dying of sickness at home.
Yeah. And you can kind of imagine that a mindset of that, like that, would kind of make you more liable to actually head out on these excursions in the first place. Mm-hmm. Because, like, life is determined, so I can do what I want to do because
this is what I'm meant to do.
It's like, it's going to end when it's going to end. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, in my mind anyways, it made them more ferocious, and I think you can tell also from like different sources, like written sources, that's what, like, fellow Europeans were up against when they met the Vikings in the battlefield, wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, though of course, I mean, in continental Europe, Britain, Ireland, I mean, you had the Christian God on your side, right? I mean, it's a powerful force in itself, which is why when something, when there's one of those initial raids on Jarrow, shortly after Lindisfarne, the Viking raiders, they get away, but then God intervenes and blows them back to shore and shipwrecks them, and so that the locals can massacre them. So it goes both ways, right? I mean,
It does. Yeah, it's funny. So, if you could time travel, what thing back then would you most like to see or experience?
Just for my personal interest, I'd like to see how politics played out, actually.
Yeah. You'd like to visit a thing?
Yeah, I would. And also I would like to see what goes on, in the hall or behind closed doors in the hall, how power was made and negotiated.
So you wouldn't want to see the great halls of Uppsala to see if Adam of Bremen was full of shit or not?
Well, that'd be kind of cool too, wouldn't it? I suppose to get to the bottom of that one, that would be pretty neat. But no, I just wonder. It's actually almost it might not be what you expect from my answer there, but I mean, again, to me, all of these things are very closely linked.
Yeah.
And there's stuff that actually we can't see archaeologically, and we don't necessarily get to through the texts.
Yeah. So, but what about the politics? Well, what we know about the Viking politics fascinates you. Like, and I know what my thought is, but like, what's your fascination?
For me, again, not that I was ever really given, I didn't really learn much about the Viking Age as a child in school or anything like that. But actually, again, there is always this notion that these people, they are the other, the uncivilized other. Whereas what we're showing, in increasingly more and more is that these were, who's surprised that they were very sophisticated, had very, well organized institutions that allowed them to achieve big things, despite being, not centralized kingdoms like you have elsewhere in Europe at this time. So actually to kind of understand that, and it goes back to, again, like you mentioned, the great army and the structure of that. How the hell do you do this? I would love to see how those negotiations played out. What's at stake? What has to be promised? And the kind of the dynamics of that. That fascinates me.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you, but actually mine is a little bit more to the more like the actual workings of a thing. Like how did you judge differences between people? Like the day-to-day, like solving conflicts, using a rule of law which was not written down, but somebody had it in their head.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and like how that actually played out. That would be very interesting to see, I think.
And we know that the law was so important, right? I mean, this is, again, it's something that we wouldn't, when I was younger, wouldn't have appreciated it. This was a society that was heavily governed by the rule of law. And as you say, I mean, what I believe actually one of the law codes actually even talks about this, doesn't it? When someone can't, when the certain number of people have to learn the laws, and when they don't agree, that's when they go to the books, right? They have at that time by the medieval period. But yeah, I mean, to see how that played out would have been quite fascinating.
Yeah,
learn a lot from it as well.
I think so too. And you learn. I think that's probably would be the best way to learn about the society as a whole, I think. So, just to run things off, and this is the big question, the big one. Would you have wanted to live back in the Viking Age?
Oh, no.
Why? Why not?
I like the fact that, if I cut myself and get an infection, I can go to the doctor and get antibiotics.
Okay.
No, I mean, I of course, I would be fascinated to see how the past played out. I would love to see how the past played out before my eyes, but no, I'm afraid I have no desire to live there.
Yeah.
Very privileged to be where we are right now.
Well, we have our own challenges, but yeah, I totally agree with you. It's a fascinating period of time, I think. But I think it would be well. It depends. I would assume that if you were born during that age and grew up during that age, you wouldn't know anything else.
No, indeed.
But if you were just suddenly transported back there, knowing what I know, maybe I would rather stay here.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we do have a tendency to romanticize the past, of course, and Yeah, I think seeing things also with a clear eye, as it were, is important.
I think that's a great way to end this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. It was great talking to you. And have a good one.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you're watching us on YouTube, hit that bell button.